In the final years of World War II, Adolf Hitler was no longer winning the war, but he was still deciding how it would end. Germany's cities were in ruins. Its armies were retreating on every front. The Allies were closing in from the west. The Soviets were already at the gates of Berlin. And yet, the orders kept coming. Bridges were to be destroyed. Factories were to be burned. Railways were to be torn apart. Not to stop the enemy, but to deny survival to Germany itself. Hitler no longer believed the German people deserved to live if they could not win. Inside collapsing bunkers, generals argued, pleaded, and finally fell silent. Some disobeyed, others obeyed, and watched the country unravel. This was not a final battle. It was something darker, a war against his own nation. The Third Reich would not fall because it was defeated. It would fall because one man chose destruction over surrender. This is the story of Adolf Hitler's last decision, and how the end of the war became one final act of obsession, vengeance, and irreversible collapse. By late 1944, the war Adolf Hitler had unleashed across Europe was already lost. The question was no longer whether Germany would be defeated, but how long the defeat could be delayed, and at what cost. The illusion of control remained, even as reality collapsed. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army was advancing relentlessly. Entire German divisions were being wiped out or forced into retreat. Cities that had once been showcased as symbols of Nazi power fell one by one. In the West, Allied forces pushed through France and toward the Rhine. The Luftwaffe was shattered. Fuel was scarce. Ammunition was rationed. Trained soldiers were replaced with boys and old men. Yet inside the Führer's headquarters, the tone was defiant. Hitler refused to acknowledge defeat. To him, the war was not lost. It had merely entered a phase that demanded greater sacrifice. He spoke of willpower, destiny, and betrayal. Failures were blamed on generals who lacked faith, officers who hesitated, and civilians who no longer believed strongly enough. Reality was no longer the enemy. Disobedience was. As the military situation deteriorated, Hitler retreated further into isolation. Physical illness weakened him. His hands trembled. His posture slumped. But mentally, his worldview hardened. The more desperate the situation became, the more extreme his thinking grew. Germany, he believed, had failed him. The German people had not risen to his expectations. They had not fought with sufficient fanaticism. They had not proven themselves worthy of victory. And if they were not worthy of victory, then perhaps they were not worthy of survival. This was not rhetoric. It became policy. In September 1944, Hitler issued orders that made his thinking unmistakably clear. Cities were to be defended to the last man. Retreat was forbidden. Surrender was treason. Commanders who withdrew without permission faced execution. Even when positions were indefensible, even when defeat was certain, resistance was mandatory. The result was catastrophic. Entire units were destroyed rather than preserved. Civilian populations were trapped in battle zones. Infrastructure that could have supported recovery was sacrificed for symbolic defiance. Germany was not being defended. It was being consumed. Hitler's obsession with control extended beyond the battlefield. As Allied bombings intensified, he ordered that no preparations be made for post-war recovery. There would be no rebuilding plans, no contingency measures. The future, in his mind, did not exist beyond victory or annihilation. The logic was brutal but consistent. If Germany could not win a war, then it had no right to exist afterward. This belief marked a turning point. The war was no longer about defeating external enemies. It became an internal reckoning between Hitler and the nation he claimed to represent. Senior officials began to understand the danger. Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments, saw that continued obedience meant destruction. Military commanders quietly ignored orders when possible. Local leaders delayed demolitions. Some sabotaged directives from within, but open resistance was rare. Fear still ruled. Hitler's authority, though increasingly detached from reality, remained absolute. The system he had built rewarded obedience and punished dissent. By the time his thinking crossed into self-destructive extremism, the machinery of the state was too rigid to stop him easily. Germany was approaching the end of the war, but Hitler was approaching something else entirely. What followed would not be a final stand against the Allies. It would be a final verdict on his own people. And it would culminate in one of the most chilling orders ever issued by a head of state, an order that revealed how far Hitler was willing to go to ensure that if he could not rule Germany, no one else would. On March 19, 1945, as Allied armies closed in from every direction, Adolf Hitler issued one of the most shocking directives in modern history. It was called the Nero Decree. Officially titled the Decree Concerning Demolitions in the Reich Territory, it ordered the destruction of Germany's own infrastructure. Bridges, factories, railways, power plants, water systems, anything that could support civilian life or military recovery, were to be destroyed before falling into enemy hands. But this was not a military necessity. It was ideological revenge. Hitler believed Germany had failed him. The people had not fought fanatically enough. The army had retreated instead of dying in place. The nation had proven unworthy of survival in the world he envisioned. And so, if Germany could not continue the war, it would be erased. In Hitler's words, the German people had shown themselves to be the weaker and therefore deserved to perish. The logic was chillingly simple. If the German nation could not win, then it should not exist. This was not a scorched earth policy aimed at denying resources to the enemy. Allied victory was already inevitable. Instead, the decree was meant to ensure that when the war ended, nothing remained, no functioning cities, no economy, no means for recovery. Germany would be reduced to ruins long after the fighting stopped. The order stunned those who received it. Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments and War Production, immediately recognized what the decree meant. Germany's infrastructure was already crippled by bombing. Food shortages were severe. Transportation barely functioned. Millions of civilians were displaced. Carrying out the Nero Decree would guarantee mass starvation and societal collapse. For the first time, Speer openly defied Hitler. Rather than executing the order, Speer quietly sabotaged it. He delayed demolitions, issued vague instructions, and encouraged regional officials to ignore or reinterpret the decree. In private meetings, he argued that destroying Germany would be a betrayal of the people Hitler claimed to protect. Hitler was unmoved. He dismissed concerns for civilians entirely. If the population could not endure the war, then their suffering was proof of weakness. Survival, in his worldview, was reserved only for the strong. Compassion had no place in defeat. This was social Darwinism taken to its final extreme. The state existed only to serve victory. Without victory, the state and its people were expendable. Across Germany, the decree created chaos. Some local commanders obeyed orders and destroyed bridges and factories, even as refugees streamed through the streets. Others refused outright. Many simply did nothing, paralyzed between obedience and survival. The regime was collapsing from within. Hitler's control, once absolute, now depended on fear rather than loyalty. His orders grew more detached from reality, more symbolic, more punitive. The Nero Decree was not about strategy. It was about judgment. Hitler was passing sentence on his own nation. As Allied forces crossed the Rhine and Soviet troops advanced toward Berlin, the consequences of the decree became clear. Cities were reduced to rubble not by enemy fire alone, but by deliberate German demolition. The infrastructure that could have eased post-war recovery vanished. Germany's destruction was being completed by its own leadership. By April 1945, even Hitler's inner circle understood that the end was imminent. But the Nero Decree revealed something deeper than desperation. It exposed the final truth of Hitler's rule. He did not see himself as a servant of the German people. He saw himself as their judge. And in his final weeks, he chose annihilation over accountability, destruction over surrender, death over a future without him. By April 1945, Adolf Hitler no longer ruled Germany from grand halls or public rallies. He ruled from underground. Beneath the shattered streets of Berlin, the Führerbunker had become the final center of the Third Reich. Thick concrete walls muffled the sound of artillery. Electric lights replaced daylight. Maps covered the walls, but they showed armies that no longer existed. Here, cut off from reality, Hitler clung to command. The world above was collapsing. Soviet forces were closing in from the east, street by street. Allied bombers reduced Berlin to ruins. Refugees flooded the city. Food was scarce, ammunition scarcer. Yet inside the bunker, the routines of power continued as if the war could still be won. Hitler held daily military briefings. He studied situation maps with trembling hands, issuing orders for divisions that had been destroyed weeks earlier. When officers cautiously explained that these units no longer existed, he exploded in rage, accusing his generals of betrayal, cowardice, and treason. In his mind, Germany had not been defeated by overwhelming force, but stabbed in the back once again. Reality became negotiable. Hitler's physical condition deteriorated rapidly. He walked with a stoop, his left hand shaking uncontrollably, his speech slurred at times. Witnesses described long silences, vacant stares, and sudden violent outbursts. Medications supplied by his personal physician were constant and heavy. The man who had once mesmerized crowds could barely sustain focus. As the bunker filled with staff, secretaries, military aides, and loyalists, it also filled with fear. Some still believed in miracles. Others understood the end was near, but remained out of duty, loyalty, or paralysis. No one dared speak the truth openly. Hitler's worldview narrowed further with each passing day. He became obsessed with loyalty tests, executions, and imagined conspiracies. The failed assassination attempt of July 1944 haunted him. Every setback reinforced his belief that enemies surrounded him, foreign and domestic alike. The German people themselves became suspects. In conversations with those closest to him, Hitler spoke openly of annihilation. He declared that if Germany fell, it deserved to fall. History, he believed, would absolve him and condemn the nation for failing to live up to his vision. The bunker was no longer a command center. It was a courtroom. On April 20th, Hitler's 56th birthday, he emerged briefly from the bunker into the daylight, his last public appearance. He greeted members of the Hitler Youth, boys barely in their teens, sent to defend Berlin against tanks. He thanked them, shook their hands, and returned underground. Above him, those children would soon die. Back inside, the atmosphere grew increasingly surreal. While the city burned, Hitler married Eva Braun in a brief ceremony. Champagne was served. Final wills were dictated. Orders continued to be issued. Orders no one could carry out. Hope, when it appeared, was irrational. Hitler fixated on imaginary counterattacks, convinced that last-minute reversals were still possible. He spoke of betrayal by the SS, the Wehrmacht, even the German people themselves. Loyalty to him had become a currency already spent. As Soviet artillery drew closer, the bunker shook constantly. Sleep became impossible. Staff whispered about escape. Some fled. Others were prepared for death. Hitler did neither. He had long decided his fate. To surrender would mean acknowledging failure. To flee would mean living in a world without power. Neither was acceptable. In his mind, the end of the Reich would coincide with the end of himself. The bunker was no longer a refuge. It was a tomb waiting to be sealed. By the final days of April 1945, there was no longer any illusion of survival inside the Führerbunker. Soviet forces were less than a kilometer away. Artillery shook the concrete ceiling day and night. The end was not approaching. It had arrived. On April 29th, Adolf Hitler dictated his final political testament. In it, he denied responsibility for the war, blamed Jews and international conspiracies, and condemned his generals for betrayal. Even at the edge of collapse, he refused accountability. The document was not an admission of failure. It was a final act of accusation. That same night, he married Eva Braun. The ceremony was brief and subdued, conducted in a small bunker room by a civil servant. There was champagne. There were awkward smiles. Outside, Berlin was being erased block by block. The marriage lasted less than 40 hours. By the morning of April 30th, Hitler had made his decision unmistakably clear. He would not be captured. Hitler had seen what happened to Mussolini just days earlier, dragged through the streets, beaten, executed, and displayed publicly. The prospect of humiliation terrified him more than death. To be paraded by enemies, stripped of control, and reduced to spectacle was unacceptable. Death, on his own terms, was the only option. Shortly after lunch, Hitler said goodbye to his remaining staff. Witnesses later described the moment as stiff, formal, almost mechanical. There were handshakes, brief words, no speeches, no apologies. Then he and Eva Braun retreated into his private room. What followed lasted only minutes. Eva Braun swallowed a cyanide capsule. Hitler used poison as well, but he also shot himself in the head, ensuring there would be no chance of survival. When aides entered the room, both were dead. Adolf Hitler was 56 years old. The war in Europe would continue for 8 more days. Immediately, the next phase began not of history, but of secrecy. Hitler had given explicit orders that his body not be captured. His remains were carried up to the Reich Chancellery Garden, placed in a shell crater, doused with gasoline, and set on fire as Soviet shells fell nearby. The cremation was hurried, incomplete, and chaotic. By the time Soviet troops reached the site, there was little left to identify. This absence created a vacuum, and into that vacuum rushed speculation. The Soviets recovered fragments of burned remains, including jawbone pieces later used for identification. But Stalin, suspicious by nature and eager to manipulate uncertainty, deliberately fueled rumors that Hitler had escaped. Soviet officials contradicted one another publicly. Stories circulated of secret tunnels, double bodies, and flights to South America. The myth began almost immediately. In the West, the lack of a visible body fed conspiracy theories. Sightings were reported across Europe, then in Argentina, Brazil, and even Antarctica. Intelligence agencies investigated some claims, dismissed most, and quietly closed files. Yet the idea persisted. The reason was not evidence, but psychology. For many, Hitler's suicide felt unsatisfying. There was no trial, no punishment, no public reckoning. Death had spared him judgment. The enormity of his crime seemed incompatible with such a quiet end in a concrete room. A myth felt more appropriate than reality. In truth, the evidence was clear. Dental records matched. Witness accounts aligned. Soviet files, later declassified, confirmed identification. Hitler did not escape. But myths are not born from facts alone. They are born from discomfort. The secrecy surrounding Hitler's death, intentional and accidental, allowed the story to fracture. And in that fracture, fiction took root. The man who had built his power on spectacle vanished without one, leaving behind rumors instead of a corpse. Ironically, this final act reflected his entire rule. Control through uncertainty, power through fear, influence through the manipulation of belief. Even in death, Adolf Hitler distorted reality. But the myth obscured a harsher truth. He did not vanish into legend. He died defeated, hidden underground, while the world he tried to dominate closed in around him. The bunker did not preserve his power. It buried it. When Adolf Hitler died beneath Berlin, Germany did not fall silent. The guns continued to fire. Cities continued to burn. Millions of soldiers and civilians remained trapped in a war that had already been lost. The Führer was gone, but the system he created still functioned, grinding forward on inertia, fear, and obedience. Germany in May 1945 was a landscape of collapse. Entire cities lay in ruins. Berlin, Dresden, Hamburg, Cologne, once symbols of industrial and cultural power, were reduced to fields of rubble. Railways were shattered. Factories stood gutted. Food was scarce. Refugees flooded roads in every direction, fleeing advancing armies, often with nothing but what they could carry. And yet, in many places, German units continued to fight. This was not courage. It was conditioning. For 12 years, the Nazi state had demanded total loyalty. Obedience was framed as a virtue. Dissent was treason. Retreat was cowardice. By the final months of the war, this ideology had become deadly not only to enemies but to Germany itself. Hitler's orders were still being enforced even after his death. The Nero Decree, his command to destroy Germany's own infrastructure rather than allow it to fall in enemy hands, had already inflicted catastrophic damage. Bridges were blown. Power stations were sabotaged. Transportation networks were deliberately crippled. The logic was clear. If Germany could not win, Germany did not deserve to survive. Some officials resisted quietly. Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments, later claimed he sabotaged parts of the order, preserving what he could. Others followed it to the letter, ensuring maximum destruction. The result was suffering on an unprecedented scale. Civilians paid the price. In cities encircled by Allied forces, commanders delayed surrender out of loyalty or fear. The Volkssturm, elderly men and teenage boys, were thrown into hopeless defenses. Children carried weapons they barely understood. Families were caught between advancing armies and retreating German units that punished any attempt to flee. Absolute obedience became a death sentence. The psychological damage was immense. For years, Germans had been told victory was inevitable, that sacrifice would be rewarded, that the Führer saw all and would deliver salvation. When that promise collapsed, it left a vacuum of meaning. Defeat was not just military, it was existential. Many Germans struggled to reconcile reality with belief. How could total victory end in total ruin? How could unquestioned loyalty lead to annihilation? These questions haunted survivors long after the war ended. The collapse forced a reckoning not only with destruction, but with complicity. The Allies encountered a nation physically broken and morally stunned. American, British, and Soviet troops documented starvation, displacement, and shock. Entire populations wandered through rubble in silence. There were no celebrations, no speeches, only exhaustion. Germany had driven itself into oblivion, and then the camps were revealed. As Allied forces advanced, they uncovered concentration camps across the Reich. Survivors emerged skeletal, barely alive. Piles of bodies testified to industrialized murder. The scale of the crime shattered any remaining illusions. The cost of obedience was no longer abstract. It was visible. For many Germans, this was the moment denial collapsed. The argument that one could obey orders without responsibility no longer held. The system had demanded compliance at every level, and millions had complied. The ruins of Germany were not just the result of bombing. They were the result of choices made, repeated, and normalized. Obedience without limits had hollowed out the nation. In the weeks following the surrender, Germany ceased to exist as a unified state. It was divided, occupied, and dismantled. Its future would be shaped by former enemies. Sovereignty was gone. Pride was gone. What remained was survival and memory. Hitler had promised greatness through obedience. What he delivered was ruin through submission. Germany's destruction was not inevitable. It was prolonged by loyalty after logic had failed, by orders followed after purpose was lost, by a system that punished independent thought until none remained. The lesson was written in rubble. When obedience becomes absolute, destruction follows. When the war ended, silence settled over Germany, but it was not peace. It was a quiet of shock, guilt, and uncertainty. The Third Reich had collapsed in 12 years, leaving behind tens of millions dead, a continent in ruins, and a nation forced to confront what had become under Adolf Hitler. The question that followed was unavoidable. Who was responsible? At Nuremberg, the Allies put surviving Nazi leaders on trial. The proceedings were unprecedented. Never before had a defeated regime's leadership been held publicly accountable for crimes against humanity. Evidence was laid bare, documents, photographs, testimony from survivors. The world listened as the machinery of genocide was exposed in meticulous detail. Many defendants claimed they had only followed orders. It was the same defense echoed across Germany. Soldiers, officials, bureaucrats, guards, clerks, each insisted responsibility lay above them. Each pointed upward, toward Hitler, toward the system, toward inevitability. The trials rejected that logic. Obedience, the court declared, did not absolve moral responsibility. This was a radical shift in international law and in historical judgment. Yet for ordinary Germans, the reckoning was slower and more painful. Entire generations had grown up inside Nazi ideology. They had pledged loyalty, sung the songs, repeated the slogans. Many had known fragments of the truth and chosen not to look closer. Others had truly believed the lies. After 1945, both groups were left with the same burden, memory. Denazification attempted to cleanse society, but it was uneven. Some former Nazis were removed. Others quietly returned to public life. The Cold War accelerated compromises. Justice competed with pragmatism. Accountability was incomplete. The question of guilt is never fully settled. In East Germany, responsibility was framed as a Western problem. In West Germany, silence dominated the early years. Families avoided uncomfortable conversations. Children grew up sensing something was wrong, but not being told what. The past became something whispered about, never fully addressed. It would take decades before that changed. By the 1960s and 1970s, a new generation began asking questions. They challenged their parents. They demanded truth. Trials resumed. Memorials were built. Education shifted from avoidance to confrontation. Germany slowly accepted a painful truth. The crimes were not committed by monsters alone, but by ordinary people operating within a system that rewarded obedience and punished dissent. Hitler's legacy was no longer just destruction, it was a warning. He did not seize power by force alone. He was enabled, supported, applauded. His authority grew because institutions yielded, because fear silenced opposition. After all, loyalty replaced conscience. The final catastrophe was not the result of a single man's madness, but of millions surrendering judgment. That is why Hitler's end still matters. His suicide did not resolve history. It did not bring justice. It did not answer the question of responsibility. Instead, it transferred that question to everyone who survived him and to every generation that studies him. The danger was never just Hitler. It was a system that demanded total obedience. The culture that normalized dehumanization. The belief that loyalty excused cruelty. Those forces did not die in the bunker. They did not vanish in 1945. They remain possibilities wherever power goes unquestioned. Germany's post-war transformation, its democracy, its commitment to remembrance, its rejection of militarism, was an attempt to answer that legacy. Not perfectly, not completely, but deliberately. The past was no longer denied. It was confronted. Still, the question endures. When authority demands obedience at any cost, where does responsibility lie? When institutions normalize cruelty, who is accountable? When silence feels safer than resistance, what is the price? Hitler's final days were marked by isolation, delusion, and collapse. But his true legacy is not found in his death. It is found in the choices others made while he lived, and the choices future generations must make when faced with similar pressures. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it asks the same questions again and again. And the most important one remains unanswered until the moment it is tested. When obedience leads toward destruction, will people follow or will they refuse? That is the question Hitler left behind, and it has never stopped being relevant.